The gospel reading for today is from Mark's gospel. They came to Jericho, and Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd, as they were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Years ago, Sam Wells got a surprise visit from a man he hardly knew. The man was a CEO of a prominent corporation in the city which Wells served as a pastor. This man was one of those people that no matter how accomplished he was, somehow the hair or the shoes, something was always slightly askew. Wells had only met him once before, very briefly. Wells, who is now pastor at London St. Martin in the Fields, but before that for years was dean of Duke Chapel, said, "This man sat in the corner of my study, chewing his fingernails and holding rather nervously a homemade cassette." Okay, for those of you who may not know, cassettes were things that were made to record music in the olden days, before the time of compact discs, which themselves were back in the days before music just dropped from the cloud. Anyway, Wells said, I guess it was not small talk for which this man came to me, and the man finally broke the ice. "I've come to see you because there's no one else I can tell. I want to be a Christian. In my world, that's like saying I'm crazy. Last night I got up in the early hours and made this tape, and it says everything I want to say, and I want to leave it with you because there's no one else I can tell." That man probably became a Christian the moment he handed over the tape. Sometimes it's as simple as that. Before that moment, there were probably years of wrestling and countless sleepless nights. Often it is as difficult as that. But in the end, the CEO just drove to find the only pastor he'd ever met, handed over the tape, and that was that. That man and that little cassette tape may be the closest we will ever come to meeting Bartimaeus. Mark's gospel is roughly divided into two halves. The first half is set in Galilee. Jesus heals people. He calls disciples. He teaches, often in parables, and he gets in some scrapes with the local authorities. In the second half, the scene shifts to Jerusalem. There Jesus faces controversy, his identity is disclosed, and he is led to crucifixion. The story of Bartimaeus is the climax of the first half of this story. To understand Bartimaeus, we need to go back to the parable of the sower and the soils in Mark chapter 4. There Jesus talks about four kinds of earth: the path, the rocky ground, the thistles, and the good soil. The first half of Mark's gospel illustrates these four kinds of discipleship. Some seed falls on the path, like the religious establishment that reject Jesus outright. Some falls on stony ground, like the disciples who tend to wither anytime there is opposition. Some seed falls among the thorns, like the rich young man who calls Jesus, and Jesus speaks to, but he just can't leave his money behind. And then there's the good soil. This refers to those who hear and accept the word and bear fruit in abundance. There aren't many of those in Mark's gospel, but Bartimaeus is certainly one of them. Mark's gospel tells a story in which those who are professional, holy people and those who have the most exposure to Jesus and his teaching, and those who have the most money and status and security all fall away, supplanted by this lone, solitary, blind beggar who alone does exactly what Jesus asks him to do and then follows Jesus on the way. I think we tend to eye this text with a measured uncertainty. As a metaphor, we can really like this text. But as we sit with it, and its way of putting our competence and our accomplishments and our security at risk, I think we take a step or two back. As when in the final verse of the first half of Mark's gospel, the first become last, and the last, exemplified by blind beggar Bartimaeus, are first. The heart of the story of Bartimaeus lies in his cloak. The cloak is the one thing he has. It's the source of Bartimaeus' protection from dust, from wind, from rain, from cold. It's also the source of his income, kind of like a street musician's open guitar case. This is the crisis of the story. Bartimaeus has one thing, and he wants one thing. He has a cloak. He wants to see. How much does he want to see? Enough to part with his cloak? Absolutely. He parts with the one thing he has in order to receive the one thing that really matters. And Jesus, in this moment, stands still, as if to emphasize the timelessness of the moment, and asks Bartimaeus the penetrating question, "What do you want me to do for you?" Bartimaeus has no hesitation. He knows exactly what to say. The rest of the first half of Mark gives us plenty of examples of people who, unlike Bartimaeus, can't bring themselves to shed their cloak. Probably people like you and me from time to time. This story confronts us with two overwhelming questions. Are we prepared to shed our cloak? And when we come face to face with Jesus, will we know what to say? This is not a once and for all kind of decision, not ever. This is truly an everyday lived choice for each of us. It's an everyday choice for pastors. It's an everyday decision for congregations who seek to be faithful in this brave new world. But how fervently we organize our lives so we are never in Bartimaeus' position. Isn't that what our accumulation is all about? Wealth and possessions are the most reliable cloak we know. They protect us from vulnerability of facing personal or medical or career or social disaster. The trouble is, the more we possess, we know our possessions begin to possess us. For people, for families, for pastors, for churches, managing money, managing property, managing public image can be time-consuming to the point of becoming overwhelming. We become kind of like that Michelin tire character surrounded by layers of insulation, and the idea of springing to our feet and following Jesus seems next to impossible. And when Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" our first instinct is almost always going to be bound up to firm up the insulation. Or, Jesus, could you just keep housing prices rising? But, of course, wealth and possessions are by no means the only cloak. For James and John, status is just as compelling. What is status? And why do we crave it so? Status is a way of trying to assure ourselves that we have everyone's admiration so we can convince ourselves we don't need their love. At any age, we can fall into the clutches of this craving. So can institutions. So can nations. That's what the CEO that paid Sam Wells that visit was struggling with. He was coming to terms with the reality he was going to have to lose people's admiration. And he was going to need their love in a way he'd never had to ask for it before. If we won't allow ourselves to shed the cloak of status, and Jesus asks us, "What do you want me to do for you?" what will we say? Something like, "Make everyone admire me or envy me or even fear me, but never put me in the position where I need them to love me." Knowledge. Knowledge is its own kind of cloak. Doesn't matter whether it's philosophy or law or medicine or theology or physics. When we've read all the primary literature and every scholarly article on the subject, we've built a pretty impressive cloak. We know all there is to know, and we can think of 1,000 reasons carefully outlined and delineated why we should not leap to our feet, and 100 ways to deconstruct Jesus' call. But where does that get us in facing Jesus' question, "What do you want me to do for you?" What do we ask? Build us a bigger library? Alas, not all cloaks are some kind of worldly thing. There are plenty of religious cloaks, too. There's the cloak of our religious experience and the cloak of our particular religious approach. Maybe we're worried that other Christians, other types of Christians, seem to be a bit fuzzy on things that we think are important in just one way, worship or scripture or polity or you name it, or how to do this or how we should view that, or things whatever it is we've tried so long and so hard to be so certain about in our faith. Our certainty, our religious orthodoxy and righteousness, that too can become a cloak. So that when we stand at last and face Jesus face to face and he asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" all we have to say is, "Jesus, prove my way of thinking about you right and everybody else's wrong." We may have made for ourselves a cloak of social righteousness where we've managed to boycott all the right things. We've avoided eating all the wrong things. And we correct everyone when we catch them using insensitive or inappropriate language. When Jesus asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" we will find ourselves saying, "With all due respect, Jesus, isn't it time you started driving a Prius like I do?" And then there's one last cloak that I think a lot of us have. It is the tendency to think about the Christian faith as some sort of insurance policy, like some durable legacy passed down through the generations that doesn't require a great deal from us in our lifetime other than our verbal assent and a regular deduction from our bank account. It needs a bit of adjusting for us when there's a major life transition, but otherwise it just kind of ticks on like a useful, unobtrusive annuity, lifting anxiety about the future and making it easier to plan for the unknown. We're used to delegating complex parts of our life to professionals, so how convenient to get God to handle the eternal life contract. When Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" we may feel no urgency when we say, "Just give me what I've paid good money for." If we remotely, tangentially, recognize ourselves in any of these descriptions, or if family, or if nation, or if anything else in all creation has become our cloak, the story of Bartimaeus and the new sight he received is saying one simple thing to us today. It's time to shed the cloak. The fact is, Every day, it's always time to shed and reshed our cloak. Making such a cloak for ourselves amid the uncertainty of our life and the fear of death, that is completely understandable. Keeping such a cloak as our source of identity and security is a very common and understandable thing to do. But if we truly want to meet Jesus face to face, if we long to leap up in joy and delight because we've put our trust in no one and nothing but Him, it's time to shed our cloaks. Imagine Jesus calling you from the other side of a fast-flowing river. You're wearing the cloak, your precious, custom-fit cloak. Jesus is calling you by name. And you start to cross in the water still wearing the cloak. You get deeper and deeper, and the cloak is getting heavier and heavier. And everyone watching can see that you've got to stop and shed the cloak, or you're not going to make it to either bank in safety. I wonder if that's where any of us are today. I wonder if that's where a whole lot of our churches are today. It's time to shed the cloak. It's time to part with the insulation, to dispense with the insurance package that prevents you and me from coming face to face with Jesus. The rich young man wouldn't part with his money, that's his cloak. James and John wouldn't part with their status, that was their cloak. God shed God's cloak when God came naked among us in a manger in Bethlehem, when God hung naked outside of Jerusalem on the cross. God shed God's cloak because God wanted so desperately to stand before us and to be in communion with us. It's time to shed our cloak so that we can stand before God. It's time to shed it. Why must we shed our cloak? Because Jesus, sooner or later, one way or another, is going to ask all of us and all our churches, what do you want me to do for you? And if we're all bound up in a cloak, we're going to be very limited indeed in the range of answers we're going to be able to give Jesus. In particular, we're going to find it impossible to give Jesus the answer He so wants to hear. We're not going to be able to leap up in joy like the blind beggar. We're going to find ourselves dreading the conversation. When Jesus said, "What do you want me to do for you?" Bartimaeus, without hesitation, said with resolve, "Let me see again." Think about what those words really mean. Bartimaeus is saying to Jesus, I want you to change my life. Bartimaeus is blind and he's a beggar. That's what he is, and that's how he makes his living. When he begins to see, he loses his identity as a blind man, and he loses all the security of the income that is bound up in begging. He's stepping into the unknown, a world that he cannot begin to imagine. Small wonder he didn't want to shed the cloak. Small wonder we don't want to shed our cloak. Stepping into the unknown. That's a risky act of faith. That can happen even in congregations as strong as this one. This can happen even with a pastor as strong and gifted as Ben. It's time to shed the cloak. All of us, sooner or later, can find ourselves standing before Jesus as Bartimaeus did, saying, I want you to change me. I want you to change us. I want to become what only you, God, can make us. I want you to open my eyes so I can enter a whole new reality, like a blind man opening his eyes to see the world for the first time. Let me into that world, please, Jesus. I'm leaving my cloak behind. I really realize now it's useless. let me into this world. Every single congregation I know that is thriving in the 21st century in ministry has exactly that urgency. After the chief executive left Sam Wells' house all those years ago, Wells found himself with this audio cassette in his hand. He went over to the cassette player, put it in, pressed play. He heard the sound of his visitor clearing his throat in a kind of a self-conscious way. Then there was a long silence. And then more, clearing his throat. And then to his astonishment, he heard this proud, powerful man begin to sing a simple song. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back.